How's it going, everyone? Coach TK here, and today I'm going to be bringing you another video on advanced protocols. And we're going to be looking at everything regarding accessory movements, how to implement them, how to make them more efficient, how to manage fatigue in certain ways. We're going to be tackling all of that. So tune in and enjoy.
All right, so we are talking about accessories and how we can make the most out of every single one that we are doing. So we're going to be looking at a couple of different things, starting off with exercise selection for the squat, the bench, the deadlift, and some other lifts. Okay. Then we're going to be moving on to something I call efficiency modalities. Okay. This is basically just making the most out of every accessory that you do. Okay, and we're going to be looking at some interesting ideas there. Then onto the standard stuff like volume and intensity. Okay, knowing how far to push these accessories as well. Keep in mind, okay, we are going to be talking about accessories geared towards increasing the main lifts. Now, there are people that have some body composition goals, okay, and to some extent, it is necessary to induce some body recomposition for the sake of the three main lifts as well. But we will only be talking about powerlifting specific accessories, okay, not necessarily geared towards any other goal. So let's start off with the exercise selection. Now this is going to be the simplest one, okay? So let's tackle it one by one. We'll start off with a squat. Now, what do we need for the squat in terms of accessories? Well, we know that for the squat, okay, we have the hip joint and the knee joint at work, okay? And obviously the spine needs to be stabilized through some muscles as well, but we'll take it joint by joint, right? So keep in mind that these accessories that I'm going to mention, firstly, they're just going to be a bunch of random examples, okay, with a specific goal. But also, this is purely to strengthen, okay, given tissues. So you don't have to do all of these accessories, okay? It's just ideas for if you want to strengthen or grow these muscle tissues. So let's start with the first one, the knee joint. Okay, we need to extend the knee joint in the squat, and so the quads are going to be our main mover. So when we want to work the quads, okay, and if we want to grow them or strengthen them, okay, we will incorporate some of these accessories. Something like a belt squat, or a leg press, or a hack squat. Okay. Now, also keep in mind, we are not talking about variations here, purely accessory movements. Okay, so no similar movement pattern lifts. Okay, nothing that's going to be very specific towards the main lift. That's variations. Okay, we're talking about purely accessories here. So for the knee joint or for the quads, okay, we're going to look at knee extensors like these three. Then we've got the hip joint at work. That needs to extend as well in the squat. So what is our primary hip extensor in the squat? The adductors, okay? It's not the glutes, it's not the back. Okay, the back is in charge of stabilizing the spine under load. It's not in charge of extending the hips. The adductors are, okay? So exercises for the adductors, as simple as Copenhagen planks. Then maybe some unilateral lifts, like Bulgarian split squats. Everyone hates those. And something like a walking lunge. Okay, just some random examples. Now, there will be some crossovers here. So we know that in the belt squat, if we do something like a wide stance, we'll hit the adductors really well. Okay, some deep leg presses, adductors will be hit really hard as well. So there will be some crossover, but just getting the idea of what movements to do to target specific muscle groups. Okay, so these are just some random examples. Then we can do some other lifts, okay, that will target things like the glutes specifically if we want to do very specific glute training. So note that something like lunges and split squats and leg presses, they all hit the glutes. But if we really want to very specifically target the glutes and isolate them, okay, we can do things like clams. We can do things like hip thrusts, but it won't be as common as you think. Okay, if we do these other lifts the right way and bias, okay, certain muscle groups like the glutes, okay, we can get a lot out of it, and we'll talk about how to make that as efficient as possible. Okay, Then we can do things for the back like good mornings. Okay. Just building the stability, building the strength of the erectors, that's going to translate into the squat very well. Okay, so those are just some random examples. Let's move on to the bench. Okay, we know that the elbows need to extend, triceps, and we know that the shoulder needs to come across, or the humerus needs to come across. That's going to be the chest, the front delts, and obviously with the arch in the bench, okay, there's a lot of tension on the rotator cuff muscles to stabilize our shoulders, and our lats, of course, obviously also stabilizes our scap. So we need to make sure that we're hitting movements that are going to make sure that we can stay tight in the bench as well. So 3 things to look at. We've got the triceps. Again, that can be any overhead extensions. Okay. Why overhead extensions? Well, when we are flexing the shoulder joint, okay, and we open up here, we know that the long head of the tricep crosses the shoulder joint. And so in this position, we can get the most length out of the long head of the tricep, okay? As opposed to when we do like a push down, we're not getting as much length out of the long head. And that is the position where we have the most growth if we have tension in that position. So overhead movements are fantastic for the long head and probably preferred for isolated tricep movements. Okay? Then you can do push downs or extensions or whatever. Okay? Those are going to be the main ones. You can get creative with that, find exercises that work well for you and stimulate your triceps well. So yeah, that's going to be triceps. Then, okay, we got the pecs that need to work really hard. This is going to be our main mover in the bench. Okay, so things like dumbbell presses, machine presses, dips, push-up variations, flies. These are all options that you can go for. Obviously, there are presses that will be a little bit more specific to the lift, but that's besides the point, okay? These will all work really nicely. Then they will obviously also target the delts, but if you do want to do some very delt-specific work, you can do overhead presses, and I prefer to use dumbbells for that. The reason why is because we can be quite limited with our range when we are using a barbell for overhead presses. So I almost always, if in the rare case that I throw in an overhead press, because it's usually not necessary at all, there are almost always better options. Okay, but if we want to do an overhead press, our chest maybe gets fatigued very quickly, but we can get some more volume in the shoulders and the triceps. Yeah, I'll throw in some overhead presses, and in the rare case that I do that, I will always use dumbbells. Okay, it's just better range. You can get better execution, better comfort, and better stimulus. Okay, then we're looking at strengthening the shoulder stability. Okay, things like the rotator cuff. Okay, so rotation work is going to be vital. Maybe some rear delt work is going to be good, and some other shoulder training. Okay, which we'll get to in a moment in this little bracket over here. And then for the lats as well, very, very important. We all know that the lats are important for the bench. Okay, the lats don't extend and contract in the bench press. That's not what they do. I know some people like bigger back, stronger bench. Okay, it's not because they are going through contraction and lengthening. It's simply just stability. Okay, the lats will keep the shoulders nice and tight in the right position to allow us to have a better foundation to bench from. Okay, so any sort of pull downs or rows. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment as well in this little bracket. So then we get to the deadlift. Now this one is interesting because we've got a little bit more than we think that we can work on. Firstly, okay, we know that the hip joint needs to be extended. Okay, that's going to be glutes and hamstrings and some adductors. So we can get some adductor training through here, these couple that I mentioned, and we can get some extra glute training here as well. But for the most part, we want to target the hamstrings, and then we want to target the back for spinal stability. Okay, the brace is going to be very important here as well, and because the bar needs to stay nice and close to the body as we come up, right bar path and keeping tight, we do want to train the lats as well. Now, There's very little lengthening and contraction happening during a deadlift, but to some degree, it is definitely necessary to have strong lats to stabilize our spine. Okay, they also do a very good job at doing that, and B, okay, to keep the bar nice and close to the body to decrease the moment arm, making the lift easier. So the lats are very important for the deadlift as well. So let's look at the hamstrings first. Okay, so hamstrings, we're going to have hamstring curls. Now that can be seated or lying, but a seated hamstring curl is nice because you get to flex the hip joint as well, meaning that at the top of the movement, okay, you're lengthening the hamstrings fully because the knee joint is extended and the hips are flexed. So almost always, if I had to pick one hamstring curl to do, I would almost always pick the seated hamstring curl over the lying one or standing one, okay, for that simple reason, unless there's novelty needed and changing movements around and progressing them separately, I'll throw in a lying one. Or a lying one as an extra one, or if equipment is limited. Okay, but for the most part, if a seated hamstring curl is available and you can still progress well with it and you don't need any novelty, the seated hamstring curl. Okay, then we can do some single leg RDLs or some good mornings. Okay, for the most part, we're not really going to be tackling variations once again. So we're going to be looking at very, very low specificity lift here. Okay. Then we've got lats, okay, rows and pull downs, like I've mentioned before for the bench. Okay, it's not going to be rocket science. But then we want to look at some things for the brace, okay, for the back, for the erectors, to stabilize that. Now that can fall into the squat as well. But let's look at some other ones here. Now, we can do things like a what is going on here? Weighted planks. Okay, we can do things like QL training, okay, or some oblique training if we really want to do that. We can do ab training as well, okay, and we can do rotation work. The spine, okay, I know we've got rotation work over here for the shoulders. I'm talking about the spine specifically, working in the transverse plane. Okay, that's going to be stabilizing the spine. Now we can do all sorts of rows as well, and any sort of like RDLs or deadlift variations to strengthen the core and the erectors as well. But again, we're looking at accessories only. Okay. Then other. Why is this important? Because we not only want to strengthen and grow muscles, okay, but we also want to maintain the ones that we've already got. So for example, you want to train your side delts. Why? Well, if you don't train them at all and you don't get enough stimulus through some pull downs or other shoulder work or whatever, you might just lose them, okay? Especially if you're not eating in a surplus or if you're not eating in a maintenance either. And though training your side delts might not increase something like your bench, okay, losing them might decrease your stability. So we definitely want to make sure that we train muscles just to maintain them. That is 6 sets a week, 8 sets a week. It's not a lot of training, it's just enough to hold onto the tissue. Bicep training. Now, even though there are some evidence to suggest that biceps stabilize the bench really well, okay, you still want to just train them for the sake of holding on to the biceps, okay, because if they have some correlation to the bench, we want to make sure that we're holding on to that tissue. So typically, delt training and bicep training is always going to be in the program to some degree, just to hold on to tissue, okay, and even though they're not really going to do much for the main lifts, it's just to hold on to tissue. And then I would typically say doing like any sort of back training and maybe some core training. Actually, no. So we want to target all the things that we might not get enough stimulus for. So even though we are benching and deadlifting, if we're not specifically trying to strengthen the back, okay, by doing extra back accessories, if you're not doing any back accessories at all, you might just lose some mass on your back. So we want to make sure that we always have it into some degree. It doesn't have to be a crazy amount of volume and intensity, but to some degree to hold onto the tissue. Okay, so that's for the most part going to be what exercises we're going to be looking at to do for the main lifts and to hold on to tissue. Now, let's talk about the real reason why we're here, and that is why or how we can make these accessories efficient. So, first and foremost, if you know me well, you know that I'm a big believer in this, and I will preach it to every single human being on this planet that trains for growth or strength, and that is full range of motion. You do not want to know how often I see people still doing hack squats to 90 degrees knee flexion, doing dips to 90 degrees elbow flexion, doing dumbbell presses to 90 degrees elbow flexion. I just can't understand why people would not want to increase stimulus on the tissue that they work in. So, full range of motion, what's that going to do? Okay, that's going to lengthen the tissue that you're training to a greater degree. That is where the most growth occurs. That is where the most force production adaptations occur. And for the most part, you will just have a lot more blood flow and a lot more improvements in terms of progression in whatever lift it is that you are doing. So full range of motion is completely scientifically and evidence-backed modality in order to improve your strength and growth, and we're using this for the accessories, right? So that's going to be one way. Okay, the next one is going to be something called zero acceleration. Okay. Now, typically, I won't throw zero acceleration into my training modalities specifically unless the way that people do an accessory is really fast. For example, I often see people leg pressing where they drop the weight down and then press. They drop the weight down and then press. Or they do a dumbbell press and they drop the weight down and get a nice bounce out the hole, getting a little rebound and then pressing up. Okay. In that case, I will specifically throw in this zero acceleration to teach the individual that's training, okay, to slow down their reps. Now, something like a belt squat, usually that's not necessary. Something like a lunge or whatever, that's not necessary. Or bicep pulls or tricep pushdowns, usually they do it quite slow and controlled. And so I wouldn't throw this specific thing in because they're already doing it that way. But typically, all accessories we want to do with slow and controlled eccentric, maybe a slight pause at the bottom for the most part, and then contract. Okay, this is going to be necessary to get as much stimulus out of the tissue as possible. Okay, no one cares, no one in powerlifting cares how much you can dumbbell press, how much you can one arm dumbbell row or pull down. Okay, yes, it might look impressive if you're busy doing the lift, but honestly, the point is getting the most stimulus out of the tissue. Okay, it's not a main lift. We're not pushing numbers. We just want to stimulate the tissue. And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make that as efficient as possible. So zero acceleration training will have a good way we can do that. Now, what do these two things do? Okay, typically they will lower the weight on the bar. Why is that a good thing? Okay, if we incorporate, let's take a dumbbell press for example. We go half reps and we rush it. Okay, we get a nice rebound at the bottom. Okay, it's halfway down, but let's say we get a good rebound still. Okay, you could be pressing the 60 kilos in each hand for a set of 12 reps. Now what we do is we go full range of motion. Okay, that can cut you down to about 45 kilos, maybe even 40. Okay, let's say 45, and we go zero acceleration, bring you down to like 35 kilos. Now we are pressing the 35s instead of the 60s. What is that going to do you think? Okay, it's going to decrease systemic and joint fatigue. Okay? To an extent, we can't really say that it'll decrease the muscular fatigue because honestly, it will actually increase it. But that is what we are trying to work. We are trying to work the muscle tissue. But typically, we're not trying to tax the system or tax the joints. Okay, we don't want that extra fatigue. And so when we do these two things, when we incorporate this into all of our accessories, we are actually lowering the weight on the bar or on the dumbbell or on the machine. And by doing that, we are decreasing our total fatigue, decreasing joint inflammation and fatigue, we are actually allowing ourselves to recover better in our total training. So there is no downside to this. It can only do you really, really well. Okay, that is if your ego doesn't get in the way, because that can be the only possible reason why you would want to do as much weight as possible on this machine or that machine. Okay, obviously we do want to move heavy weight, and we do want to progress from week to week or block to block, but in the circumstances of full range of motion and zero acceleration training. Always, 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 always. Okay, it will only do you good. Okay, so that is how we make it more efficient. Now, given that, okay, let's look at the full range of motion. Let's give some examples as to how we can do that. I'm just going to name random examples for people to get creative. Okay, one thing I've been doing recently on my belt squat, okay, because it's a little bit of a pendulum or a hinge. Fantastic machine. Thank you, Travis Gamble from TG Fitness, for setting up 2 of these in my gym. And this thing is fantastic. Okay, in terms of the range, okay, the belt that we ordered from a different company, okay, is a little bit slacky, okay, a little bit long, and so when we hook it onto the machine, okay, we can only get so much range. Now, typically, there is more than enough range if we want the belt squat to be very specific to the normal squat, because remember, we can do belt squats not only for quad development and adductor development, we can do it because it's a very high specific movement for the squat without taxing our back. Okay, but typically if our goal to use it is as an accessory to strengthen or grow our quads, okay, we want as much range as possible. So then we might want to increase the range a little bit, and the way to do that is to make it deficit, standing on a platform. Okay, I use 2 bumper plates that I put my feet on with a little gap between them where the machine can pass through. Okay, that will increase the range. Okay, let's look at another way. Okay, when you're doing lunges, okay, doing a reverse lunge on a platform, okay, will increase your range. Remember, when you're doing a lunge, okay, the back leg, you can only go down so far as that back leg can go before the knee touches the floor. So when we are jamming the knee into the floor, we might have more range in the leg that's working, but we just can't go lower. So what do? Do we just carry on as normal and say, well, that's the furthest I can go? Or do we make a plan to go down further, get more range in the knee joint, more range in the hip joint? Answer, I think, is yes. So if we stand on a platform, a bumper plate, a block, or a box, okay, we can get a lot more range out of this lift, and it will help us to gain some strength and growth and decrease fatigue. So that's one way that we can do that. Then we can look at something like a push-up. Okay, how can we increase the range in this? Well, if you take something like a bar, okay, and you set it up low, so low setup, you can get a lot more range by just allowing your chest to pass that gap between the dip bars. Okay, instead of just doing a normal push-up and going down to the floor, and you're like, okay, well, I can't go further because the floor is in the way. Instead, we want to elevate the surface, okay, so that we can get more range. Something like a dumbbell press. Honestly, just flare the elbows and allow the dumbbells to pass your chest. Okay, instead of just stopping where the dumbbells come down, flare the elbows, bring the dumbbells down, and I call it tucking the dumbbells into your armpits. Okay, you'll get tremendous stretch and allow yourself to get a lot more stimulus on the pecs. Okay, for something like, now this isn't really an accessory, but it can be a great tool, okay, is a cambered bar for the bench press. Okay, now you can do like a close grip Larson press with a cambered bar or something like that, but the cambered bar is basically like, has a little arch in it, and it allows you to go down further, just get more range out of the chest and even your triceps as well. So these are just some random examples, okay, to get you to get a lot more range. Let me give another one. Okay, so maybe something like, this is an interesting one, between rows and pull downs. Okay, now we know that rows are necessary to get a really, really good contraction. and we are quite limited with how much we can contract things like our load traps and our rhomboids and our rotator cuff muscles, teres, etc. by doing pull downs. But for the most part, we want to bias pull downs over rows. Why do we want to do that? Because most growth happens in the lengthened portion of any lift. So when we are doing pull downs, we get a lot better stretch and lengthening of the tissue, like in the lats very specifically. But in rows, we don't. Okay, we might get a slightly better contraction, but for the most part, it's not going to be as tremendous as the amount of length we can increase on when doing pull downs. So typically, I bias pull downs just for that sake, for the sake of getting more length out of the lats and all the upper back muscles. Again, that's a great way that you can increase range of motion and allow yourself to get a lot more stimulus in the tissue. Okay, so those are some ways that you can do that to increase range of motion. Now, let's move on to volume and intensity. So volume, okay, typically what I like to do is I like to throw in the right amount of volume to start off with for us to get good stimulus. Now, this can be 3 sets, this can be 6 sets of something like a belt squat or a tricep push down or a overhead press or anything like that, okay? It's going to be completely dependent on your response. Okay, it's going to be completely dependent on your response and how sore you get, or how much stimulus you get, or how big of a pump you get. Okay, so start off with the right amount of volume for you. Typically, practically, starting off with 3 to 5 sets is a good idea. Okay, 2 sets might be slightly on the low end. You just don't have enough amount of experience in the lift itself to be able to progress it well from set to set even. And anything more than 5 sets might just be redundant, or anything more than 5 sets will just be, or leave you no room to progress. Okay. This is where we get to increasing volume, because we want to start off with a certain amount and increase over time. Okay, from week to week, block to block, we want to increase the volume. Basically what we're doing is, with a certain amount of volume that we do, we start making adaptations to that amount of workload, and our body just diminishes the returns. So we need to add more workload for our body to receive more stimulus for more growth. Okay, but if we start off with, say, 6 or 7 sets, I mean, how far can you go before it just becomes redundant? Okay, going up to 10 sets on a particular lift, okay, it's just going to be so much that by the time we're getting to the last few sets, okay, the returns are very low, our ability to perform it well is very low, and the fatigue really sets in locally in that tissue that we're working, that we just can't get a lot out of it. Okay, this is also why we don't really want to do more than 2 accessories for a particular muscle per session. Okay, if you're doing a hack squat and then a belt squat and then a leg extension and then lunges, I mean, honestly, how much are you going to be getting out of those lunges and leg extensions after those really high quality hack squats and belt squats that are completely taxing your quads? Okay, you just won't be getting in really good, efficient work. So it's not really going to do much for you to do those extra 2 quad movements. Okay, you're just increasing fatigue tremendously and not getting a lot of stimulus at all. And that's obviously not the goal with training. We want to get the most out of the least workload possible. Okay, so minimum effective volume, right? That's how they say it. So we, where was I going? So we want to make sure that we've got room to progress, right? So start off with 3 to 5 sets, and then you have room to progress over there. So let's say you start off with 3 sets in week 1, and you go to 4 sets in week 2, maybe linger there for a couple weeks, and you go to 5 sets, then you go to 6 sets, and by that time you are close to ending the block. And you've made significant progress, you've gained significant stimulus, and we're getting a lot out of whatever accessory it is that we're tackling. Okay, so we want to progress volume over time. Now, in the case where we want to typically get more force production rather than just growth, okay, we know that there's only so much volume we can do in our total training, okay, before our system starts to tax. So when we are busy with really high intensity blocks, we call them strength blocks, okay? When we are busy with these high intensity, high demand, high specificity blocks, specifically for our main lifts, okay, there's only so much volume we can do on the other accessories and the other muscle groups that isolate them before we just run out of resources to recover. Okay, so in this case, what I like to do is keep the volume the same throughout the block and just increase the intensity. Now we're going to look at intensity and how to do that, but for the most part, you can stick to just 5 sets with every week and just increase intensity. Okay, that's completely fine, and for the most part, that's what we do for movements like for the side delts or for the biceps or even for the triceps. And honestly, unless you need growth specifically for tissue, you don't need to progress volume, really, okay? There are instances where it does help with improving the lift, and more stimulus and more work capacity, okay, is also an aspect. But typically, if you're not looking for specific hypertrophy, you don't really need to progress the volume at all. You just need enough volume for you to push that specific lift really hard and progress the weight over time. Because it's the weight on the bar, the intensity, the RPE, how close you train to failure, etc., that's really going to push the force production. So that's what we're looking for. Now, that aside, let's look at intensity. Okay, moving on swiftly. For intensity, okay, we can work with RPE for the most part. Why? Okay, we can't really use percentages for accessories because we don't know what a 1 rep max looks like. Okay, and typically it's going to be very dependent on how well you execute the lift. You're going to have to spend months and years on that lift to actually find out how much you can do for 1 rep. So it's very difficult to estimate that. But with an RPE, it's a lot easier, okay, in terms of practicality as well. There's not a lot that goes into most accessories in terms of the amount of joints working and technique and things like that. So it's very easy to just use RPE or RIR, okay, to determine how far we need to push ourselves. Now, typically, anything less than RPE 6, not a lot of stimulus. Okay. And yeah, so anything less than RPE 6, we're just not really getting much out of it. There's no real point. We just may be getting some blood flow, but not really taxing the muscle or putting it in a hypoxic state for it to produce a lot of, or to induce a lot of growth or strength. So not really a lot of point in anything below RPE 6. So let's look at what we can do when we start off with, say, an RPE 6 or 7. Okay, so typically when we start off a block, again, we want to increase over time, and if we start too high, there is no room to progress, just like the volume. So when we're starting off with an RPE 10, where we go, where do we go from there? Okay, we start off week 1, RPE 10, like no holds barred. Now where do we go? We have nowhere to go. Okay, we have nowhere to improve. Yes, people can say you can throw more weight on the bar and 2.5 kilos here and there. Honestly, it's just not going to be enough progression from week to week, in my opinion. Okay, at least not to induce direct strength or even somewhat growth. So we want to make sure that we start off with a lower RPE. I would say usually around 7 to 8 for accessories. Okay, now why are you doing that? 7 to 8 RPE, and we progress to 9 to 10. Okay, so we start off with, say, 7, and over the block we can add weight, increase RPE, maybe even add some volume if that's the case, and we end off with an RPE 9 or 10. Okay, where we get some really good stimulus, and yes, the fatigue will exponentially increase, but by that time we have made adaptations to handle higher intensity, and we are closing in on a deload where we can decay all of that fatigue. So it is fine for us to use those last week or two to really push. Okay. Now, what are some other ways that we can increase intensity? Okay. We've looked at RPE. Now we can look at something like top sets. drop sets, and monster sets. Okay. So drop sets for accessory lifts, very uncommon, but it can be a psychological thing to help an athlete push really hard. Because let's be honest, for the most part, by the time we're done with our main work and our variations, we go on to accessories and we don't want to do them. We are tired, we are taxed, we want to go home and eat pizza and ice cream. We don't want to do freaking Bulgarian split squats after 10 sets of squat and squat variations. Honestly, no one wants to do that. But for the most part, we know that if it's programmed, there's a reason for it and it will help us. So what do we do to get ourselves a little bit enthusiastic about an accessory? Well, a top set is a great idea. When we have a top set, we've got this natural inclination to hype ourselves up or stimulate ourselves to get to a really big weight, really push and get it over and done with. Okay, so we get a little bit of that hype aspect when we do a top set of any kind, and so throwing it in as an accessory is a nice way to get some good quality work done with really good intention and quality. Okay, so doing a top set with just straight up back downs, just like you would your main work, that's a good idea for some accessories if you struggle with the enthusiasm aspect. Okay, drop sets. In terms of time and volume, it's a great way to get some extra blood into the muscle. Okay, decreasing the load a little bit, but really getting some good high intensity quality work in for us to get more blood flow, more stimulus, and a little bit less fatigue on the joints. Okay, drop sets are obviously drop sets for a reason. Okay, you decrease the load, and so by doing that, you decrease the fatigue slightly in the joints and the system. Okay, now we move on to monster sets. Now this is a tricky one, and I'll do a completely separate video on this, but it's basically a rest pause set kind of idea, but slightly different. Okay, for a monster set, basically, if we want to do, say, for example, 4 sets of 15 reps, okay, which will equal 60 total reps. Okay, note that by the time we get to the 10th rep, that's when the real good quality reps set in. The first 10 reps are honestly only there to get us into a lack of oxygen state, or hypoxia, as they call it. So there's really only so many efficient stimulative reps that we're getting out of these 60 total reps. So let's say the last 5 of every set, okay, that's going to be 20 total effective reps. Now what we do with a monster set is we take the first set to 15 reps, okay, and then we have a rest time, a lot shorter than we used to, and then we keep going, same weight. We need the same load on the bar or the dumbbell or whatever to make sure that our volume stays the same, right? Okay, and we just keep going with more reps. Okay, we might get a lot less reps because of the rest time and because the load stays the same, but now we do reps, rest time, reps, rest time, and we keep going until we get to the goal volume, which is 60 total reps with XYZ kilograms. Okay, and so what we're doing now is with this rest time, every time we do our reps, okay, say it's only 5 reps that we can get out, we're getting really effective reps in because they're closer to failure. Okay, so instead of getting 60 total reps with only about 20 of them being effective, now we're getting 60 total reps with all of them being effective. Okay, the only difference now is that we're doing a whole lot more sets, but the total volume is the same, meaning that we don't get all the extra systemic and joint fatigue that we would if we were to do, say, 10 straight sets. Okay, so by doing a monster set, what we're doing is firstly making time a little bit more efficient with these rest times. Okay, but we're also making all of our reps very efficient, and we are decreasing the total fatigue by getting really, really good extra workload in. Okay, because we're not like taxing the joints and the system by just doing redundant reps just to get us to a hypoxic state. Okay, we're actually doing really efficient work with every rep that we do. So this is a very nice way. I actually use this quite a lot. It's just a nice way to decrease fatigue, be better at our time management and time efficiency, and get really good quality reps in with everything that we do. So those are some ways to increase the intensity. And yeah, that pretty much concludes it for this video. I've covered all the basic aspects of accessories. If you have any specific things that you would like me to cover, or any direction that you'd like me to go into with regards to accessories, please let me know in the comments, or DM me on Instagram, or however you want to contact me. Let me know. I love doing these videos. I love teaching. And so if I can meet your needs in the things that you want to learn about, that would be fantastic. So please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.